One of my greatest influences on doctrine and theology outside of the Bible itself is J.C. Ryle. And I've reviewed a lot of Ryle here on the channel. I've reviewed most of his works. I've reviewed biographies and his autobiography. And we're going to look at another one today. This is A Tender Lion, Not a Tender Loin, as some of my friends read it when they first saw it. The Life, Ministry, and Message of J.C. Ryle by Bennet W. Rogers. This is a beautiful book put out by Reformation Heritage Books. The book proper is 318 pages, and it's an astonishing 380 pages with an appendix, bibliography, and an index. They've done a really great job with this cloth binding, the gold lettering. I was really surprised to find that it was glued. It's not sewn, but it will still last a very long time with this cloth binding. But if you're new, let me welcome you to Petra Publications. My name is Davis, and here on this channel, I mostly just review Reformed Christian books. And if that sounds like something you're interested in, I'd love to have you join us by subscribing down below. And if you've been watching for a while, links to our donation page, where you can donate either one time or monthly subscriptions are available also. And if you're interested in merch, we have some like a merch store as well that I'll link down below. Thank you so much for your support. So normally in biographies, I don't give too much information about the person because, the whole book is about the person. And so the last couple weeks we've been going through biographies, so I haven't given too much biographical information in the reviews. Also, on our website, there's a whole page on our website devoted to Ryle and to works that I've done relating to him. So if you're interested in more information on Ryle, I will link to that below as well, where you can find his works online for free. You can find an index that I have for sale. I'm working on a couple other indexes that will eventually be available for $5 on the website. And so anyway, all that to say, lots of Ryle resources available on the website, but I will go ahead and say in this review that he was born in 1816 and he died in 1900. And Ryle's life was full of constant controversy, pushback, and disagreement. And he fought against many doctrines that were new or revitalized in the mid and late 1800s, like the doctrine of perfectionism or Keswickianism. Not sure how exactly to pronounce that word. Ryle was a man who was willing to stand alone for the sake of Christ, and he often did so. He stood up against his family. He stood up against high church. He stood up against low church. He stood up against fellow Anglicans and dissenters. He was a man who truly stood by himself, hand in hand with Christ, looking toward the cross. Ryle was a pastor, theologian, tract writer, first bishop of Liverpool, husband and father, and Ryle was a very devoted pastor, even from his first parish. And I'll read from page 30 of this biography. It says, Ryle went to work in Exbury with uncommon zeal. He prepared two written sermons for Sundays. He delivered two expository lectures each week in cottages. He taught and supervised the parish Sunday school. He kept up an aggressive system of pastoral visitation, which included visiting every home in the district each month, amounting to nearly 60 visits per week. In addition to his pastoral labors, necessity compelled him to serve as a doctor and policeman. So you see his zeal and his passion for his people, his congregation. So now we'll dive into the book review proper. This is a very academic biography of Ryle, and it's supposed to be. On page 13, Bennett says, the purpose of this work is to produce the first intellectual biography of J.C. Ryle. And it is truly fantastic. And then again on page 15, he says, the aim of this work is to present J.C. Ryle's thought, life and ministry in its fullness and context. In so doing, I hope to provide a more thorough answer to the central question of this work than has hitherto been given, and shed further light on Victorian evangelicalism in general, and evangelicalism within the Church of England in particular. And the question that he's referring to there is, who is J.C. Ryle? Who is J.C. Ryle? And he goes, that's the thesis of the whole book, and he truly dives into that very deeply. And in that light, I wouldn't recommend this biography as an introduction to Ryle. This is a very in-depth academic, very rigid kind of biography, as opposed to, say, Ian Murray's biography, Prepared to Stand Alone, or is it Prepared to Stand Alone? I've reviewed that one here on the channel as well. And his autobiography, another excellent introduction to who Ryle was. This is a much more in-depth look at Ryle's life, dealing with, as it said, the context, the historical context, the context within the Church of England and within evangelicalism at large. And so it dives into a lot of specific things that I wouldn't recommend the book for someone who hasn't read any Ryle or is unfamiliar with his work. Unlike most other biographies, this also doesn't go through chronologically. It goes through specific portions of Ryle's life topically. And this allows us to study each portion of his life individually. So, for instance, him as a pastor, him as a controversialist, him as a tract writer, him as a bishop. And so technically it is going through chronologically in that he wasn't all of those things at once necessarily, but you also get to see it in depth, each topic. And so this book also gives us a look into his political views, his pastoral philosophy. Let me read page 20 and 21. He says, he also stressed the importance of the diligent use of the means of grace. These included Bible reading, private prayer, regular attending public grace, regularly hearing the preaching of God's word, the regular receiving of the Lord's Supper. And finally, he stressed the importance of observing the Christian Sabbath as well. It talks about his theological views on page 18. Ryle's theology is best described as Protestant, Reformed, Puritan, Evangelical, Anglican, and premillennial. And that's where I leave Ryle, the premillennialism. Anyway, and his traditionalism and progressivism on page 313. It says, Ryle was both a traditionalist and progressive. Ryle's traditionalism was most evident in his theological convictions. Theologically, Ryle was a man of the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. He was a thorough Protestant, moderate Calvinist, self-professed lover of Puritan theology, and an evangelical. His Calvinism and Puritanism were especially out of step with the thinking of most churchmen of his day, as both were associated with regicide. Furthermore, he showed no interest in the theological movement of his day. He lived and died in the old-fashioned faith of centuries past. And yet, despite this, his traditionalism shows that he was rather progressive as well. It goes on to talk about how it can be seen in his stance toward new organizational reforms such as convocation and church congresses, new missions initiatives such as the special services for the working class, working men's meetings, the city missions, etc., 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 and his use and selection of hymns, which was entirely new for the Anglican tradition. And so he was a traditionalist and a progressive person. And so a very well-balanced person. If you're into nerdy things, on page 54, it talks about Ryle's preaching, and it compares, this whole chapter has compared a sermon that he preached on John 11, 1 through 44, and it compares it to a sermon that Spurgeon preached on the same passage and that Newman preached on the same passage. And then it gives a little graph showing how many words were used in that sermon, how many paragraphs were used in that sermon, how many sentences, and how many average words per sentence were in that sermon. And you can really see the difference between Ryle and these other two prominent pastors of the time. For instance, his total word count compared to Newman was almost 3 times the amount of words that Newman put in. But to Spurgeon, it was still another 500 words more. But his average words per sentence was half of what Newman was putting in. And so that kind of pushed him forward in terms of his popularity because people could understand what he was saying. The sentences weren't too long, and they could sit under his preaching, even though the sermons were that long. They were longer, much longer than Newman. And also, another thing that I wanted to mention in this review is that Rogers does a really great job at including a lot of footnotes, and that helps in terms of understanding where he's getting the information, of course. A lot of books like this end up having like little notes in there in the back. Not with this book. Footnotes in this book, and a lot of them. And so a lot of quoting Ryle, but a lot of quoting other people for the historical context that he's adding as well. So a lot of good stuff there, and then you'll find quotes and whatnot in there as well. And then this is not really so much the review as much as it is just a personal note, but when Ryle was in school, he spent a lot of time desiring to be elsewhere, and he spent a lot of time wishing that he could be doing more with his life. He felt like he was passively sitting by and doing nothing with his life, wasting his life, essentially. And on page 26, it says that Ryle later described this period of his life as a time of patient learning and not active doing. And when I read that for the first time, I thought that is exactly how I feel most of the time, is that I'm not actually actively doing anything. But there is a way that you can use the time that that God has given you that seems like a waste to patiently learn things and grow in the Lord. And so that was a great reminder to me that not all the time do you have to be doing something great. Sometimes God wants you to be sitting back and learning things, studying his word, for instance. At this point in the review, I will go ahead and read the table of contents to give you an idea of the topics that are in this book. As I mentioned, we're not going chronologically. So what is it that he talks about? Well, first you have the list of tables. I showed you that one. Then there's a preface. There's an acknowledgments. Then we get into the book proper. Christian and clergyman, preacher, pastor, controversialist, a national ministry, bishop, and then finally, who was J.C. Ryle? That's the question of the book. Then you have 2 appendices. You have a Victorian periodicals, and then secondly, J.C. Ryle's Church Congress participation. Then there's the bibliography, which is massive. I don't think I've ever seen a bibliography so large as this in a book of this size. Let me show you here if I can get it. So all of this, all of that is bibliography. It's just massive. And then, of course, there's an index. Again, love indexes in books. They're so helpful. And so yeah, that is what you will find in this book. And I'll go ahead and read just a couple quotes from this book. There aren't really like quotes that I would put down in my Word doc of quotes, just because all of this is pertaining to Ryle's life and not Christian living. But there are some really good things here if you're just looking to deepen your study of Ryle. So on page 14, he says, he described it as, this is referring to his conversion, to his salvation. He described it as a gradual process as opposed to a sudden change. So it sort of happened over a period of time. And on page 16, this is talking about the books that he found helpful. I referred to Ryle as what helped me form my theological distinctions. And here is Ryle talking about what formed his. So through this process of trial and error, he finally found the guidance he so desperately wanted in books. Those that helped him most were William Wilberforce's Practical View of Christianity, John Angel James' Christian Professor, Thomas Scott's Remarks on the Refutation of Calvinism by George Tomlin, John Newton's Cordophonia, Joseph and Isaac Milner's History of the Christian Church, and finally Edward Bickersteth's The Christian Student. And I'm not familiar with any of those outside of maybe William Wilberforce's work, so we don't read those as much now, but those are what formed and helped Ryle. On page 59, it says, from 1849 until his death in 1900, Ryle published at least one work every year. That's insane, but amazing. Truly shows his work ethic. And on page 61, it says, Ryle's tracts may be divided into three categories: published sermons, occasional tracts, and controversial writings. A very helpful distinction as you pick up Ryle's works. Page 65, it says, this is a really great story. Perhaps the most memorable of these accounts is the conversion of a Dominican priest who read one of Ryle's tracts, Are You Forgiven?, on his way to stamp out a reform movement in the Roman Catholic Church in Mexico. He was converted after reading the tract and continued to foster the movement he originally intended to destroy. The Protestant church that was born as a result grew to over 40,000 members by the end of the 19th century. There's a dog that's joining me. And that really is an amazing story. And I think when we think of the Mexican church, we don't think of Ryle, but maybe we should. 40,000 people by the end of the 19th century, that is massive compared to what it would have been, especially since the man was going there to destroy it to begin with. On page 102, it says, there is no better high priest, and Christians need no other mediator or priest. Therefore, people who turn away from Christ to confess to anyone else rob their own soul. That's obviously in response to praying to the saints, the Roman Catholic doctrine. And page 128, he says, the view which I maintain is that every book and chapter and verse and syllable of the Bible was given by inspiration of God. And on page 137, he says, this applies to today too. Some of the things that Ryle writes, you wonder how he wrote them 200 years ago when they're so relevant to today. But it says, what were the consequences of the growing dislike for dogmatic theology? Ryle believed it was creating and fostering a great instability in religion, that is, jellyfish Christianity. Jellyfish Christianity is a kind of Christianity without bone, muscle, or power. Its leading principle is no dogma, no distinct tenets, no positive doctrine. And it was producing jellyfish clergymen, young men, and worshippers. Again, that just sounds like today. I don't see where that comes from a long time ago, but or how that comes from a long time ago. And then this is a very valuable quote, something that you don't find in other biographies, something you won't find in his autobiography. I'm not even sure where Rogers found this quote. It came from strike but hear, a tract from Ryle. But it says, Tory politics were not my reason. I am not a Tory and never was. If I have any politics, get this, I am a liberal, but I am not a politician. As a clergyman, I have abstained on principle from voting at any election. This time I did vote on principle. My conscience told me that if I did not vote, I should not be doing my duty to God, my church, and my country. But I find that so fascinating that he had such conservative views of everything. And of course, liberal meant something completely different than it does today. But even still, he was a liberal. He had, as I mentioned earlier, this idea of conservatism and progressivism. And he was truly balancing both in a beautiful way, in a seemingly impossible way. On page 249, it says, J.C. Ryle's work as a party unifier, church defender, and church reformer solidified his position as the leader of the evangelical party. It also extended his influence beyond traditional party lines, brought him closer to churchmen of other schools of thought, and made him a nationally recognized church leader. Ryle was extremely important in the 19th century, and yet we almost have completely forgotten him at this point. And I'll leave you with the last sentence, of this book, and that says on page 318. It says, his boldness has been recognized, his tenderness, unfortunately, has not. So, all that to say, I highly recommend you pick up this book, which does emphasize some of his tenderness and love to his friends, his family, his neighbors, and his brothers and sisters in Christ. That is all I have for you today. If this review was helpful to you in some shape, way, or form, I always love hearing from you in the comments section down below. If this review was helpful to you, feel free to hit the like button. I would appreciate that. And that's all I have for you. So, Lord willing, I will see you again very soon. God bless.